About 4 years ago, I was sitting in a booth at Buddy's Barbecue on Broadway, across from a man named Bill Patterson. Bill had taught ancient history at UT for 31 years before he retired. We'd been at a faculty retirement dinner the week before, and I'd mentioned, probably a little too eagerly, that I'd been reading Spinoza's analysis of the Bible. Bill raised an eyebrow the way only a tenure-track historian can, and said, "Let's get lunch." So there we were, two retired teachers, pulled pork sandwiches, sweet tea with too much ice, and Bill leaned forward over his tray and said something I couldn't shake for months. "Howard," he said, "the Romans were the most obsessive record keepers in the ancient world. They documented taxes, troop movements, provincial disputes, weather patterns, eclipses, executions, everything. If even half of what the Gospels claim happened at this man's death, earthquakes, 3 hours of darkness over the whole land, dead people climbing out of tombs and walking through Jerusalem, someone in the Roman administration would have filed a report. Someone would have noticed. So I'll ask you a simple question. Where is it?" I sat there with barbecue sauce on my fingers and no answer. He wasn't being hostile. Bill wasn't that kind of man. He taught Roman history for 3 decades, and he respected evidence the way a carpenter respects a level. He was asking me to do what I should have done years ago. Stop reading only the version that was handed to me and go, look at what the other side wrote down. I drove home that afternoon with the radio off. And that night at my desk with a coffee going cold beside my keyboard, I started looking. Not at the Bible, at the Romans. At the historians who were alive when Jesus was alive, or close to it. The men who wrote for the empire, not for the church. And what I found was not that the Romans ignored Jesus. They didn't. What I found was worse. They wrote about him. And what they wrote doesn't match what you were taught. I need to show you 3 things. 3 specific details where the Roman record and the gospel accounts don't agree. And not in small ways. In ways that change the entire picture of what happened on that Friday afternoon in Jerusalem. First, let me set something straight. There are people who say there's no evidence for Jesus outside the Bible. That's not true. It hasn't been true for a very long time, and anyone who tells you otherwise either hasn't looked or doesn't want you to look. The Roman Empire ran on paperwork. Governors sent dispatches, tax collectors kept ledgers. Historians wrote multi-volume accounts of everything from military campaigns to Senate debates to the strange customs of conquered peoples. And the province of Judea, where Jesus lived and died, was not a backwater they ignored. It was a trouble spot. It had a history of rebellion, of prophets and zealots and messianic movements that made Rome nervous. Rome paid close attention to Judea. Within 100 years of Jesus' death, at least 5 non-Christian writers mention him or the movement he started. Not 5 Christian writers defending their faith. 5 outsiders. Men writing for Roman audiences, or Jewish audiences, or Greek audiences. Men with no reason to promote Christianity and in some cases every reason to despise it. Their names are Tacitus, a Roman senator and one of the greatest historians in the Latin language. Josephus, a Jewish priest turned historian working under the patronage of the Flavian emperors. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who was alive at the same time as Jesus and wrote extensively about events in Judea. Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor who corresponded with the Emperor Trajan specifically about what to do with Christians in his province. Tacitus, a historian whose work survives only in fragments quoted by later writers, but who appears to have written about events surrounding the crucifixion as early as 50 AD. That's roughly 20 years after it happened. There's also a man named Mara bar Serapion, a Syrian Stoic philosopher, who wrote a letter to his son sometime after 73 AD, mentioning the execution of what he called the wise king of the Jews, and asking what good it did the Jews to kill their wise king, since their kingdom was taken away from them soon after. The point is this: the record exists. The Romans and their contemporaries wrote about Jesus. The problem isn't silence. The problem is what they actually said, because what they said contradicts the story you grew up hearing in church in 3 specific ways, and I'm going to walk you through each one. The most important Roman reference to Jesus comes from a man named Cornelius Tacitus. Tacitus was born around 56 AD, roughly 23 years after the crucifixion. He rose to the highest levels of Roman society. He served as a senator under the Emperor Domitian. He was consul in 97 AD. He was later appointed governor of the Roman province of Asia. This was not a minor figure. This was one of the most respected political and literary minds in the history of the Roman Empire. Around 115 AD, Tacitus wrote a massive work called the Annals, covering the history of the Roman Empire from the death of Augustus in 14 AD through the end of Nero's reign. In Book 15, Chapter 44, he describes the Great Fire of Rome. July of 64 AD, the fire burned for 6 days and destroyed much of the city. Rumors spread that the Emperor Nero himself had ordered it set deliberately, that he'd watched it burn from a tower while playing the lyre. Nero needed someone to blame. He chose the Christians. And here is where Tacitus stops to explain who these Christians are and where they came from. He does this because his Roman audience in 115 AD would have needed context. Christians were known in Rome by then but not well understood, so Tacitus provides what amounts to a brief footnote. And that footnote is one of the most important sentences in all of ancient history. I need you to hear the exact words because they matter. He writes, Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a following. Stay with me on this. Read it again slowly. Pernicious superstition, the home of the disease. All things horrible or shameful. Tacitus is not writing a devotional. He despises Christianity. He considers it a disease that crawled out of Judea and infected the capital. He's not promoting Jesus. He's not defending the faith. He's explaining a social problem to a Roman readership so they can understand why Nero chose these people as scapegoats. That hostility is what makes his testimony so valuable. A friendly witness can be dismissed as biased. A hostile witness who confirms your basic facts cannot. And Tacitus confirms the core claim of the Gospels. A man called Christus was executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. The movement started in Judea. The execution temporarily suppressed it. Then it came back stronger. But look at what Tacitus doesn't say. He doesn't mention miracles. He doesn't mention a resurrection. He doesn't mention the dead rising from their tombs, or the earth shaking, or the sky going dark. He doesn't describe Jesus as divine or as the Son of God. He calls the entire movement a superstition. He calls Judea the home of the disease. And he describes the execution as a straightforward judicial act carried out by a Roman governor in a troubled province. A man was tried. A man was killed. The movement paused. Then it came back. That's the Roman report. A senator's footnote in the history of the empire. No angels, no miracles, no cosmic significance. A governor doing his job and a problem that wouldn't stay dead. Now I need to show you the 3 details where it pulls apart from the story, you know. Detail number 1. Pilate was not who the Gospels say he was. Open the Gospel of Matthew to chapter 27, verse 24. Here's what it says. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood, he said. It is your responsibility. That scene is one of the most iconic images in Western civilization. Pilate, the Roman governor, reluctantly agreeing to execute Jesus because the Jewish crowd demanded it. His hands are clean, literally and symbolically. The guilt belongs to the mob. 2,000 years of passion plays and paintings and Easter sermons have cemented that image. The conflicted Roman, the angry crowd, the innocent man caught between them. Now let me show you what the historical record says about the actual Pontius Pilate. In 1961, an Italian archaeologist named Antonio Frova was excavating a Roman amphitheater at Caesarea Maritima, the administrative capital of the province of Judea, right on the Mediterranean coast. His team found a limestone block about 2 feet by 3 feet, partially buried in the sand. It had a Latin inscription. Part of it was damaged, but what survived read in part Pontius Pilatus Praefectus Judaeae, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. That stone is now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. You can go see it, and the word that matters is praefectus, prefect. a military title, not procurator, which was a civilian financial administrator. Tacitus called Pilate a procurator because by Tacitus's time, in the 2nd century, that title was commonly used for governors of small provinces. But the stone was carved during Pilate's actual time in office, and it says prefect, military governor, a man whose primary job was commanding troops and keeping order by force. That distinction matters because it tells you what kind of man was sitting in judgment that day. Now here's a contemporary account. Philo of Alexandria was a Jewish philosopher who was alive during Pilate's governorship. He traveled in high circles. He once led a delegation to the Emperor Caligula in Rome, and he wrote about Pilate in a work called Embassy to Gaius. His description is devastating. He calls Pilate's administration one of briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, wanton injustices, constantly repeated executions without trial, and ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty. Constantly repeated executions without trial. Ceaseless cruelty. That's the man Matthew asks you to believe washed his hands and agonized over the fate of a single Jewish teacher from Galilee. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the 90s AD, records 3 separate incidents where Pilate provoked the Jewish population to the point of near revolt. He brought Roman military standards bearing graven images of the emperor into Jerusalem under cover of night. A deliberate desecration of the holy city. He seized money from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct, then sent soldiers disguised as civilians into the crowd of protesters with clubs hidden under their cloaks. When the order came, they beat people to death in the streets, and he massacred a group of Samaritan pilgrims at Mount Gerizim, which was so excessive that even the Roman legate of Syria stepped in and ordered Pilate back to Rome to account for himself. This is not a man who washed his hands of anything. This is not a man who needed permission from a crowd. This is not a man who lost sleep over one more execution in a province full of them. And the hand-washing scene itself. It appears in only one gospel, Matthew. It's not in Mark, which most scholars agree is the oldest gospel, written closest to the events. It's not in Luke. It's not in John. It's not in Tacitus. It's not in Josephus. It's not in Philo. One author, writing roughly 50 years after the events, added a scene that makes the Roman governor look sympathetic and shifts the moral blame to the Jewish crowd. One author. One scene. And 20 centuries of art and theology and Sunday school lessons have treated it as historical fact. When I read Philo's description of Pilate for the first time, sitting at my desk with a printout from an online archive, I set the page down and stared at the wall. I thought about the flannel board at Eastdale Baptist when I was 7 years old, the little felt cutout of Pilate standing beside a bowl of water, gentle eyes, clean hands, sad expression. I'd had that image in my head for 60 years. And in one paragraph from a man who was actually alive when Pilate governed Judea, that image cracked, like old paint on a fence post that's been standing in the sun too long. You touch it, and the whole layer just comes off in your hand. And underneath is something rougher and darker and more honest. Detail number 2. The execution was political, not religious. Tacitus says Christus suffered the extreme penalty. In Latin, that phrase refers specifically to crucifixion, and crucifixion was not a general-purpose punishment. The Romans had plenty of ways to execute people: beheading for citizens, strangulation, the arena. But crucifixion was reserved. It was specific. It was used for political crimes, sedition, rebellion against Rome, slave revolt, piracy. It was the punishment that said, publicly and visually, do not challenge Caesar's authority. The body was left on the cross, sometimes for days, not as justice but as advertisement. Now look at how the Gospels frame the execution. Jesus is tried before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, for blasphemy. He claims to be the Son of God. The high priest tears his robes in horror. The council condemns him. Then they bring him to Pilate for the Roman punishment. But here's the problem. Under Jewish law, the punishment for blasphemy was stoning, not crucifixion. That's how Stephen died in Acts chapter 7. A crowd dragged him outside the city and threw stones at him until he was dead. If the Sanhedrin had truly condemned Jesus for blasphemy, the expected outcome under their own law was stoning. They didn't need Rome for that. They had the authority and the precedent. But that's not what happened. Jesus was crucified by Rome, on a Roman cross, by Roman soldiers, under the authority of a Roman prefect, And look at the charge. John chapter 19, verse 19. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." King of the Jews, think about that. That's not a religious charge, that's a political one. In the Roman Empire, claiming to be a king when you had not been appointed by Rome was treason. The Latin term is crimen majestatis, an offense against the majesty of the emperor. It was one of the most serious charges in Roman law. You didn't claim kingship in a Roman province and live to tell about it. John Dominic Crossan, the Irish-American scholar who spent decades studying the historical Jesus, puts it as clearly as anyone I've read. Crucifixion was Rome's supreme penalty, its most public and visual deterrent. It was always about politics. It was always about power. The cross wasn't a theological statement, it was a billboard. And the message on that billboard was simple. This is what happens when you challenge Caesar. The Gospels say Jesus died for your sins. The Roman record says Jesus died for challenging Roman authority. Those are not the same story. And for most of your life, you were only given one of them. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying one version is right and the other is wrong. I'm saying they're different. The motivations are different. The framing is different. The meaning assigned to the death is different. And you deserve to know that two versions exist. That the Roman governor didn't see a sacrifice for the sins of the world. He saw a political problem on a Friday afternoon, and he solved it the way Rome always solved political problems, with wood and nails and a sign. Detail number 3. And this one, for me personally, was the hardest to sit with. Open the Gospel of Matthew to chapter 27, starting at verse 45. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. I need you to hear what Matthew is claiming here. Stop and hear it. Darkness over the whole land for 3 hours. Not a cloud. Not a storm. Darkness. In the middle of the day. An earthquake strong enough to split rocks. The curtain of the temple, a massive woven barrier, torn in half from top to bottom. And then the part that should make every historian's hair stand up. Tombs breaking open. Dead people rising, walking into Jerusalem, appearing to many people. If you had been standing in Jerusalem that day, and even one of those things had happened, you would remember it for the rest of your life. You would tell your children. Your children would tell their children. If all of them happened simultaneously, it would be the most documented event in the history of the ancient world. Governors would have written to Rome. Historians would have devoted entire chapters. The Roman garrison stationed in the city would have filed emergency reports. Dead people walking through the streets is not something that goes unnoticed in a city under military occupation. And yet, Tacitus, writing about this exact period, mentions nothing. No earthquake, no darkness, no risen dead. Josephus, who produced the most detailed history of first-century Judea ever written, a man obsessed with documenting every rebellion and riot and unusual event in the province, says nothing. Pliny the Younger, who wrote the emperor specifically about Christians, mentions nothing supernatural about the origin of the movement. Philo of Alexandria, who was alive and writing during this very period, says nothing. Not one Roman historian, not one Jewish historian, not one provincial governor's report, not one military dispatch. Complete silence. There's one possible exception, and I want to be fair about it. A historian named Thallus, writing around 50 AD, may have mentioned a darkness that occurred at the time of the crucifixion. I say may because Thallus's own work is lost. We know about it only through a Christian writer named Julius Africanus, writing around 220 AD, who quotes Thallus as explaining the darkness as a solar eclipse. Africanus disputes this explanation, and he's right to. He points out that a solar eclipse is physically impossible during Passover. Passover falls during a full moon. During a full moon, the moon is on the opposite side of the earth from the sun. An eclipse requires the moon to be between the earth and the sun. It cannot happen at full moon. It's not a matter of probability. It's geometry. But even if we grant Thallus's account, even if there was some unusual darkness that day, it's one line in a lost book about one single phenomenon. No earthquake, no splitting rocks, no opened tombs, no dead people walking through the streets. The most efficient, most organized, most documentation-obsessed empire in the ancient world, with its historians and governors and military intelligence covering every province, every rebellion, every unusual celestial event, and not a single one of them recorded dead people walking through Jerusalem. Sometimes silence tells you more than words, and the silence of every Roman and Jewish historian on the spectacular events described in Matthew 27 is not a whisper, it's a shout. In 1670, Baruch Spinoza published a book that proposed something radical. In its 7th chapter, he wrote that the method of interpreting scripture does not widely differ from the method of interpreting nature. Think about what that means. When a scientist studies a river, he doesn't begin with a theory and force the river to match it. He goes to the river, he measures the current, he tests the water, he compares what he finds with what other researchers found at other rivers. And if the evidence contradicts the theory, he changes the theory. He doesn't change the river. Spinoza said we should read the Bible the same way. Don't start with what the church tells you the text means. Start with the text. Study the language, study the history, study the people who wrote it and when they wrote it and what they had to gain by writing it the way they did. And then do something that seems obvious but was, in his time, an act of treason against the established order. Compare it. Place it next to other sources from the same period, and if there's a conflict, don't look away, look closer. That is all I have been doing. I took the Gospel of Matthew and placed it next to the Annals of Tacitus. I compared both with the writings of Josephus and Philo. I held a stone inscription discovered in 1961 next to a verse written in the 1st century, and 3 things didn't match. Spinoza was excommunicated for insisting that sacred texts should be tested against other evidence. His Jewish community in Amsterdam threw him out when he was 23. The Christian authorities banned his book. Every major institution of his era tried to silence him. 350 years later, his method is the standard in every serious university on earth. Comparing ancient texts against other ancient texts is how history is done. It's how archaeology works. It's how scholars reconstruct the past. But in most churches, in most Sunday school classes, in most Bible study groups, the idea that you could hold Matthew in one hand and Tacitus in the other and see where they disagree is still treated as something close to betrayal, as if honesty were the enemy of faith. Spinoza didn't think so. He thought honesty was faith's only real foundation, and it cost him everything he had. So here's what you're left with when you lay it all out on the table. The Roman record tells a story. It's not the story you heard in church. It's not the story on the stained glass windows or in the hymnal or in the voice of the man behind the pulpit. The Roman record says there was a man, a Jewish teacher from the province of Judea. He gathered a following. He said things, or had things said about him, that the Roman administration interpreted as a political threat. He was arrested. He was brought before a military prefect, a man known for his brutality, a man who executed people without trial as a matter of routine, a man who didn't need a crowd's permission and never asked for it. He was crucified. The charge posted above his head was political. King of the Jews, he died. His followers scattered. And then, against every reasonable expectation, the movement came back. Within 30 years it had spread so far that the Emperor Nero used its followers as scapegoats for a fire that burned half of Rome. Within 80 years, a Roman governor was writing to the emperor, asking what exactly he should do about these people, because there were so many of them. That's what the Romans saw. A political movement, a judicial execution, a stubborn refusal to disappear. What the Romans did not record, not once, not in any surviving text, is a resurrection, an earthquake, 3 hours of darkness, the dead walking through the streets. So I drove back from that lunch with Bill Patterson on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The leaves were turning along Chapman Highway. I didn't turn on the radio, I just drove. Because Bill was right. The Romans wrote it down. They just wrote a different story than the one I grew up hearing. And for 60 years I only heard one version. 60 years of Sunday school and Sunday sermons and Wednesday night Bible study. 60 years of flannel boards and hymns and potluck dinners, and not once, not one single time, Did anyone hold up Tacitus next to Matthew and say, look at both? Not once did a pastor crack open Philo of Alexandria and read what a man who was actually alive at the time wrote about Pontius Pilate. Not once did anyone mention that the most meticulous record-keeping empire in human history noticed the execution, but somehow missed the earthquake, the darkness, and the dead walking through the streets. I don't think most of them hid it on purpose. Most of them didn't know they were taught one version, the same way I was taught one version, and they passed it on in good faith, the same way I passed it on for 50 years in a classroom and a Sunday school room and across a kitchen table with my own children. But now you know. Two versions of that Friday afternoon exist. The one the church built a religion on, and the one the Romans wrote down in their reports and their histories and their letters to the emperor. Both are incomplete. Both come from people with their own reasons for telling the story the way they told it. The Gospels wanted you to see a sacrifice. The Romans saw a problem. Neither version is the whole truth. But if you've only ever heard one, then what you have isn't faith. It's a partial transcript. That's all Spinoza ever asked for. Both sides of the page. That's all I'm asking now. The record is there. In Tacitus, in Josephus, in Philo, in a stone pulled from the sand at Caesarea in 1961. It's been there all along. Now someone's pointed you toward it.